So series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
CISA gets serious about VMware, phishing and data related disruptions spike, and did you turn your phone off? Your phone doesn't think so. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, opinion, and most definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Jarek Beeson, the CISO with Commercial Bank at Capital One. Jarek, thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate having you here.
Happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Of course, before we move on, we want to thank our sponsor, Torque Security Automation Uncomplicated. Remember, you can join us on LinkedIn Live. Just go to CISOseries.com, look for the weekend review page, find the link. I would presume click on the link, and then you can join us live. I'm not going to wait for you, though, because we've got about 20 minutes, and let's get started. Our first story here, VMware bugs abused to deliver Mirai malware, exploit Log4 shell. Researchers say a GitHub proof of concept exploitation of recently announced VMware bugs is being abused by hackers in the wild who are focused on using them to deliver Mirai denial of service malware and exploit the Log4 shell vulnerability, kind of a classic 1-2 punch. Researchers at Barracuda Systems have observed a steady stream of attempts to exploit two recently uncovered VMware vulnerabilities. We're talking like 48 hours in terms of disclosure of these to the exploitation. This has prompted CISA to release an emergency bulletin that requires federal, civilian, executive branch agencies to either update or remove the affected software. So this kind of sounds like a perfect storm. You know, we're blending in VMware troubles with Log4Shell and Mirai, something that has been a problem even with patch systems. Do you see this as a particularly troubling scenario, Jarek, or just another day in cybersecurity?
I guess of those two options, just another day. You know, I don't have a lot to say other than this isn't going to be the last time we hear about creative ways to exploit Log4j. It's potentially the easiest to exploit vulnerability with the CVSS score of 10 that I've ever seen. This thing is going to be in college curriculum, red team toolkits, and so many more future pieces of malware. It's 2 lines of code. There really isn't much enterprises can do about it because they have to wait for their own solutions to provide an update or a patch. This is why defense in depth is necessary.
Yeah, I was going to say, reduce your fault domains, right? That's just kind of the order of the day in security in general. Log4Shell just kind of puts that to the fore, right?
Absolutely, and I would hate to be the first victim of this because there was no update for them.
It just the speed to which this was turned around is that unusual, or do we expect that now once we see kind of vulnerabilities out there?
Yeah, the bad guys are watching for our disclosures just as much as they're trying to find their own.
All right, well, moving on. 93% of organizations have suffered a data related business disruption. This comes from the 2022 State of Ransomware and Disaster Preparedness Survey from the International Data Corporation, or IDC. And they found that last year, 60% of medium and large organizations in North America and Western Europe suffered irrecoverable data loss, up from 43% on the previous year. 79% of organizations indicated they activated a disaster recovery response over the last 12 months, with nearly two-thirds, 61%, attributing these incidents to ransomware or other malware. The report sums up by saying 93% of organizations suffering a data-related business disruption over that same period in 2021. These don't sound like great numbers when you factor in these three items: ransomware, data loss, disaster recovery. I remember, I want to say like 2016, when really the discussions around ransomware were really ramping up in terms of the number of attacks we're seeing. There are a lot of discussion in infrastructure of like, who's responsible for this? Is this a DR problem? Is this a security problem? Is this a storage problem? I'm just curious, Jarek, what's your take when we're kind of getting hit on all three of these fronts now?
Yeah, those numbers, they're not great, but I'm not really a fan of this report.
Okay.
Data loss comes in many different factors. And from what I read, they didn't tie the data loss directly back to ransomware in
Mhm.
most of the report. The one part where ransomware is brought up, they said 61% of the organizations had to activate their disaster recovery process. But it said for ransomware or malware, also very vague. It's not uncommon to wipe systems and recover them if they have malware. In some people's cases, that might be part of their DR playbook. So for me, I tried to read the report for what it was, but I couldn't even see all of it because it was behind a paywall. Boo paywalls. And to me, this was just ransomware FUD.
Yeah, if you're going to release a scary report, at least let us see all the gory details for us to get fully scared on. really. That's
Right.
what I'm asking for. Is there any kind of issue, even not tied to ransomware? We're talking about data loss within an organization. I mean, does that raise any compliance red flags when we're seeing this many medium and large organizations kind of reporting that, any kind of data loss?
Yeah, data loss is definitely a concern, and it's something that we are trying to mitigate through disaster recovery programs. My problem is tying ransomware to data loss
Hmm.
because a lot of people think all you need to do is have a disaster recovery program and you'll be protected from ransomware. But the bad guys are stealing the data before they even encrypt your data. So that's why I don't like those two being correlated as often as it is these days.
No, excellent perspective on that. Moving on, our next story: phishing attacks surge in Q1. Security researchers from Kroll found that phishing emails as an initial attack vector increased 54% on the year in Q1. This rise caused incidents tied to email compromises to actually surpass ransomware for the first time in a year. Generally, attackers did not only attempt phishing emails as an initial attack vector, but also attempted to exploit vulnerabilities. Let's say it: proxy logon, log4 shell. Not too surprising to see what they're attempting, just kind of trying whatever works. And the spaghetti that hits the wall seems to be increasingly phishing attacks. So we wanted to pose the story kind of separately from the data loss issue because, here we're talking about the most infinite and permanent cybersecurity weakness of all: people. What do you think can be done to cure us humans of our inability to not click phishing links, Jarek? I'm just curious. Is there any hope, or is this just table stakes price of doing business?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we can really cure human fallibility.
Hmm.
So it's going to be something that we have to deal with. But when you look at this report, it's really new day, same stuff as well. Instead of saying phishing attack surge in Q1, you could easily say cyber attacks surge in Q1. It's the number one attack vector. So a different report could have said cyber attack surge, phishing is still the number one vector, and then got to what's more unique about the attacks. The industry for a long time has said the response to phishing is more training and awareness. Now, this is solely my opinion, but I look at training and awareness as a key aspect of reducing the noise my SOC has to deal with, not the way that I'm going to prevent people from clicking. You only need one person to click. And you're hard pressed to find any company that are doing phishing exercises where they have a 0% click rate. If you go back to any forensics report that's ever been published on an incident, it rarely says 7 people clicked on the fish. It's always traced back to a single patient zero. So I kind of said it earlier. It's about defense in depth. You cannot let a single person clicking on an email and doing something like that be the reason why your organization gets taken down.
Next story: iPhones are vulnerable to attack even when turned off. Researchers from Germany's Technical University of Darmstadt discovered that iPhone features, including Bluetooth, near field communication, and ultra wideband technologies, which have access to sensitive info through the iPhone's secure element, stay on through a low power mode even when modern iPhones are, by all appearances, powered down. Researchers assert this could potentially allow an attacker to load malware to the device and access secure data such as users' credit card info, banking details, even digital car keys. One of the issues is that the firmware updates on these aren't encrypted, and there's really no mechanism to verify them either. They're just assumed to be completely locked down. While Apple has not responded to the findings, researchers say one potential solution would be to add a hardware-based switch which physically disconnects the battery while an iPhone is powered down. So, Jarek, I mean, when I think of something clunky like a hardware-based switch, doesn't sound very Apple-like. Not, I guess it's not surprised that to see this type of vulnerability exists, but how should such a weakness translate to any CISO who has staff, maybe hundreds or thousands of people, all of whom carry smartphones? And we live in a world where we have organizations like NSO Group that are in the business of kind of storing iPhone vulnerabilities and monetizing those.
Yeah, this is an interesting. When I brought this up to my wife, and she was immediately disgusted and she felt betrayed by Apple. But the, as a CISO, I recognize that I can actually trace a phone still if it's off. That's a feature that I need. I need to be able to wipe a phone, even if someone turned it off. If someone decided to do something malicious on a phone or a phone that's stolen, I need to know that someone didn't have a hardware switch that they can turn off, and then they have complete ability to do whatever it is that they want to do on that phone. This may be news to some people, but it's not news to me. I used to work in the government over a decade ago, and we had to leave our cell phones outside of certain rooms because we knew that even when off, it was still emitting a signal. And if you tried to take it in, it would be immediately destroyed by a magnetic machine because we knew that a phone in certain rooms is a vulnerability. So for me, I don't necessarily think this is anything necessarily new, but I do think it's good for people to be aware that you can't necessarily hide. The phones today, they're more powerful than the computers that took men to the moon, right? So we need to make sure that we have the proper mobile threat protections, and organizations are going to start seeing that this is something they have to prioritize, just like supply chain was 10 years ago, and now it's really showing its ugly head. Mobile devices are going to be the same way.
It's interesting. In the reaction to the story, yours is the first to kind of point out, yes, this is on a security spectrum. Like we get the security convenience of being able to remotely find phones, wipe them when they're in this low power mode, and the trade off is, yes, there is potentially some ability to activate that thing when the device is otherwise off. But that's kind of the first time I've heard that in response to this story. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
The thing about that is we're talking about malware on the phone. Eventually, the phone's going to get turned on, right? So if you turn your phone off, unless you plan on turning it off forever, you're going to turn it back on anyways. So it's just a delayed threat at the very least.
All right. Well, before we move on to our next story, we want to spend a few moments with our sponsor, Torque. All this week on cybersecurity headlines, Torque has been talking about security myths. And so today, Friday, here's myth number 5. You should automate all security processes. False. You should automate routine, repetitive tasks that are not subject to much conditional variance, but workflows that can't be reliably managed by automation tools, such as assessing the financial consequences of a breach or determining whether a security incident should trigger an application rollback, should remain the domain of humans. To learn more about the realities of automation, head to torque.io. North Korean developers pose as U.S. freelancers to aid DRPK government hackers. It's a little bit of gig economy cloak and dagger story here. The U.S. government is warning that North Korea is dispatching its IT workers to get freelance jobs at companies across the world to obtain privileged access that is sometimes used to facilitate cyber intrusions. To get into the desired position, the North Korea's IT workers often pretend to be teleworkers. They obscure their true identity and pass as an individual from a non-sanctioned country using VPNs and IP addresses from other regions. You know, this activity could also be seen as a type of social engineering. I mean, I'm sure there are aspects of that for sure. The Treasury Department has published an advisory that helps organizations identify these workers, but in an era where skilled workers are in short supply already, and CISOs and others have to make hiring decisions, are already under pressure, and you're dealing with, a lot of times you're dealing with contractors maybe who are not even going to be directly hiring these people. What advice would you give them in dealing with this type of activity?
Yeah, you keep giving me stories that just don't surprise me. um, you know, Maybe I've been in this industry for too long, but this is a tactic that goes back to the original espionage playbook. Send a spy into a hostile foreign land under the guise of a productive worker of some sort, have them gain access, steal information, do bad things. Right? That's the way that espionage has gone for a long time. And I can't think of a more quintessential use case for background checks. Mature, well-established companies should be okay here, but there is still something that we have to deal with. We are outsourcing a lot of our work to service providers. So when I hear about this, I don't necessarily think about what I need to do, but making sure that my service providers and that all the people that I've outsourced work to, that they are holding the same standards that we have when it comes to onboarding their personnel. Companies cannot be lax on something as seemingly benign as a background check for these reasons.
Yeah, and it's that's where I think I guess I have sympathy for where obviously where I can see this being the most effective, right? Where I see the difficulty in doing this is, yeah, when you're dealing with, it's not in my, as a human resource department in a large company, it's not that I'm not doing the background checks, but we're hiring we're paying a service provider, giving them access to some form of our network or something like that, and then someone's contracting in there. And yeah, I'm sure there are, especially if it's government work, I'm sure there's all sorts of compliance checks they have to get before they get that contract right, before they even see bit number one or something like that. But even still, like it's almost, it reminds me of a lot of the problems we're seeing with the software supply chain, right? Where it's like dependency on dependency on dependency. And it's like security. At some point, something's going to slip through, and then it becomes, okay, how are we limiting the spread of information when we're dealing with either company secrets, government secrets, that kind of stuff. That becomes the key essential there.
Yeah, I agree, right? There it's a long chain in that supply chain, and one link being broken is problematic for everybody. We can have contractual obligations, we can have T's and C's, we can have all those things, but people actually have to do it day in and day out the right way, and we're heavily dependent upon them doing that.
All right, our next story here, kind of a continuing development we've been covering on daily or on cybersecurity headlines. Costa Rican ransomware rhetoric somehow gets uglier. The Conti ransomware group posted messages on their leak site notifying the Costa Rican government it raised its ransom demands to $20 million worth of cryptocurrency and threatening to overthrow the government of newly elected President Rodrigo Chavez. Conti already leaked 97% of 670 gigabytes of stolen data from government agencies, leading the government to declare a state of emergency. Conti's ransomware attacks have had significant impacts on digital services from the government, leading things like the finance ministry to tell citizens to calculate taxes by hand and pay them at local banks rather than going through an online portal. You know, this story just keeps developing. We've seen recent developments just today, even on this of how this Conti is changing tactics to kind of keep reinforcing this attack on a nation state here. An example of sophisticated cybercrime affecting infrastructure. In fact, in this case, what's interesting about this is political and social at this point, and appears to have the power to destabilize a country or at least cause them to declare a state of emergency. I'm just curious, Jarek, what are your thoughts on this?
Ah, man, first, given the state of Bitcoin today, that 20 million is easily 30 million in 6 months, right?
Yeah.
Um, this is nasty stuff. 27 agencies impacted. A lot of organizations are really the softest during M&A because threat actors know that they're so focused on so many other things. Regime change is no different. This is one of the reasons why a peaceful transition of power is needed. And from what I read, the new president is actually blaming the old president for not focusing more on cybersecurity. Now, I don't think that's the way Chavez wants to start his new reign, but fresh off the press this morning, I think as you probably alluded to, multiple outlets are saying that Conti is shutting down their operations and disbanding into multiple smaller operations. Now, Conti being one of the most profitable, if not the most profitable ransomware groups, this is particularly kind of concerning. Now, instead of a single behemoth to deal with, there will be several smaller but equally formidable instances of Conti that are expanding the ransomware threat, if you want to call it that. Now, the problem with Conti is they are constantly playing a game of chicken with their victims, and they're seeing who will crack first. And the thing about them is they are willing to share your information or actually come through on their promise. And you may think you win the battle, but all the other companies that see what happens when they don't play, they out of fear, they will end up starting to pay. So this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out, if this was really just a diversion while they were going through a restructuring. But most people don't believe this is truly a war between Conti and Costa Rica, but nonetheless, it sucks to be a Costa Rican right now.
Yeah, and I wonder if this has anything to do with the recent Conti leaks, which it hasn't seen like their most recent source code get leaked, but a lot of chat logs, back history, and stuff like that. You atomize basically, the Conti apparatus. You have now you have separate development teams with different forks of their ransomware to kind of have to deal with. I have to imagine that that had some kind of influence to it. Also, potentially, it could be a result of political squabbling too, right? But I mean, that's the reason all those leaks came out there. So really probably not the last one we're going to be seeing for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Our last story today, DWave deploys first US-based Advantage quantum system. DWave Systems has announced availability of an Advantage quantum computer accessible through the cloud, but physically located in the US. DWave reported that the newly deployed system is the first of its Advantage line of quantum computers available through its Leap quantum cloud service. The new system is based in the University of California as part of the USC Lockheed Martin Quantum Computing Center, hosted at USC's Information Sciences Institute, a factor that may encourage U.S. organizations interested in evaluating quantum computing that are likely to want the assurance of accessing facilities based in the same country. So, Jarek, quantum computing is one of those technologies that appears to be lurking just over the horizon until one day, boom, right in front of us, comes with a raft of security priorities and changes and a lot of considerations to take account of. Although a previous guest has suggested that quantum computing will be equally accessible to both sides in some sort of eventual cyber war, do you have thoughts or concerns about its arrival in general?
Yeah, I'm not going to name drop, but there's somebody that I highly respect that has put quantum computing as the top 10 cyber risks that we need to be preparing for. Your previous guest is right. If the bad guys have quantum decryption, we have quantum encryption, effectively creating a stalemate. But I have two thoughts on that. First, quantum will be available to the haves, not the have nots initially, simply for economic and financial reasons. And the concern for me there is the have-nots are the minority are the majority, and they're going to leave a lot of SMBs that our nation depends on at greater risk. The other more pressing concern is that we have leaned so heavily on the viability of our current encryption standards, so much so that when data is stolen, we kind of just shrug it off if it's encrypted. Well, that data is being stockpiled, and the shelf life on that data is immeasurable. Those files that took thousands of years to decrypt will be decrypted in minutes, if not faster, thus kind of cracking the once considered unbreakable locks, protecting the treasure trove of data that we have that's now sitting in our adversaries' data lakes. So this is definitely something that's concerning just because quantum is coming. This specific thing that DWave is doing, great. I'm happy. Hopefully we have applicable, beneficial use cases. But from a security perspective, quantum is concerning.
Yeah, and we've been covering some of the updates that, all of the quantum resistant encryption that NIST has been working on, that kind of stuff. And of course, we'll be keeping you up to date on that on cybersecurity headlines. So make sure you stay tuned for that as more developments pop up. The quantum computing security conundrum will continue to be something we hit on as relevant. Jarek, before we get out of here, any thumbs up or an eye roller story for you today?
The eye roller is just the fact that there's another vulnerability that's using Log4j. That'll just be the headline for the foreseeable future. It is what it is.
All right, and before we get out of here, where can people find you? I know you have all sorts of your fantastic show, Seat at the Table. You've got some podcast ventures out there. Where can people find you and all the stuff you're working on?
I'm most active on LinkedIn. I have two podcasts, one called Cyberside Chats, bridging the gap between the legal and cybersecurity industries. And then I also have a show called Seat at the Table, which airs once a month on Sands, and it's on LinkedIn Live and YouTube.
Excellent. And are you hiring? I think that's the question on the tip of everybody's tongue right now.
Capital One is hiring. We have roughly about 100 roles open in cybersecurity at all levels.
All right. Well, Jarek Beeson, the CISO Commercial Bank with Capital One, thank you so much for being on the show. This was fantastic. Thank you for talking us through the FUD, the scariness, and the fascination all throughout. I didn't think we'd get in, by the way, on moon technology referenced on the show. I super appreciate that. And Eddie Thomason given a shout out. So I was happy to see you there. Really cool to see.
Hey, Eddie.
All right. All right. And before we get out of here, of course, we want to thank our sponsor, Torque Security Automation Uncomplicated. Just a reminder, next week, there will be no episode of the Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review Short, nor will there be a Super Cyber Friday, merely an adequate analog Friday. We'll have to make do. We do apologize, but be sure to come back Friday, May 3rd for Hacking the Attack Surface, an hour of critical thinking about losing top-down control of data and users. And of course, we'll be back with another Week in Review show starting as always at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Pacific on May 3rd as well. If you haven't done so already, check out our new show called Capture the CISO. It's a competition show where CISOs judge vendors on 3 key variables. Is it innovative? How easy is it to deploy? And does it solve a real need? Excuse me. I said May 3rd for coming back for all of our stuff. It's June 3rd because May 3rd has already passed. That's how time works. So all of our shows will be June 3rd. My apologies for that. Of course, we've got all sorts of great stuff. You can find out all about it at CISOseries.com. They haven't screwed up the dates, so make sure you check out that. And if you want to check out Capture the CISO, just look for the blue Capture the CISO logo. Final plug before we get out of here. Our producer, Steve Prentice, has a new book out, which should be of interest to cybersecurity people. It's entitled The Future of Workplace Fear. I'm holding it up here for our video viewers. How Human Reflex Stands in the Way of Digital Transformation. Talks about the various types of fear people have around change and how this might impact your deployment of phishing tests, password management software, and hybrid workplaces. It even has a quote from Andy Ellis and the great and mysterious David Spark himself. It's published by A Press and available at Amazon and many other fine book sellers. Check us out. Cybersecurity headlines every single day, though. 6 minutes. We'll get you caught up on the week or on the day's news as it happens. Until next week, I'm Rich Straffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.